I first have to ask you, Ron, I've known you for a long time. I was singing your praises because I think you're an absolutely brilliant writer and a great political reporter in every way. And, have you ever experienced anything in your fairly long career, not that long?
Well, long enough, yeah. No, and the answer is no. I mean, like we are living in a different political era. I mean, in so many ways, but most importantly, in the level of division and of separation between red and blue America. I mean, I was watching. I don't know if you watched Trump last night.
I, I was curious. Don't normally do that, but I flipped over to Fox News and I watched it, and it actually it made me really sick.
Yeah, well, I mean, he didn't basically. He said the Democratic Party is a communist party. He said, much like, and David Perdue in his little video said, basically, if Democrats win these 2 Senate seats in Georgia, America as we know it will cease to exist and we will never get it back. It will be destroyed. And this kind of apocalyptic vision that, well, wait a minute. Like, really, if you elect 2 Democratic senators from Georgia, a country that's existed since the 18th century will cease to be what it has been. That level of kind of apocalyptic vision is something different in American politics, and it kind of reinforces what we are going to see today in Georgia, which is this microcosm of what's happening in the country. This enormous separation along demographic and geographic lines between the 2 coalitions. I've been covering politics since '84. That was my first presidential election. And I feel like I am less covering elections than I am kind of recording a census. It's sort of like, it's like which one of these 2 Americas is bigger in any given place, because there's just less and less overlap between them. And it's a scary trajectory that we are on. I mean, it is one in which the kind of the bonds hold, look at what's happened since the election. How many Republicans have been willing to go along with subverting the election to try to maintain power on this argument that there was, massive fraud in cities with large Black populations. I mean, not to, you can't really put too fine a point on that. I mean, it basically just signals to me kind of the level of animosity and acrimony and distrust that now defines the system. It's not exactly parallel. It's obviously deeper on the Republican side, but on both parties, there's this sense that if the other wins, the results are catastrophic, and I don't think American elections can kind of bear that level of weight.
Yeah, I also, though, there are a lot of people. I mean, we've talked about this ad nauseum. We meaning the body politic, but this huge gap in terms of people are saying stop talking about Trump. Sometimes people like the comments, sometimes they don't. Maybe I will turn them off, but I think there are people who are good people who believe this from the the bottom of their hearts. They believe this, and so I guess the question is, how did we get here? And would you say it's the bifurcated media landscape that's largely responsible for it? Because I still believe that this is probably one of the root causes of it.
Yeah. I think the bifurcated media environment is important, but I will differ from most in that I do not think it is the most important factor. I think the most important factor is what we have seen since the 70s, really and accelerating since the 90s, is the geographic and demographic separation of the parties. That the vast majority of Americans now live in places that lean overwhelmingly to one side or another. And so they are surrounded in their daily life by people who are consuming one sort of media or another, but also reflect all sorts of demographic and cultural characteristics or another. I think the figure is that I haven't seen the update for 2020. It's similar. In 2016, the national election was decided by about 2 points. Clinton beat Trump by about 2.5 points. But 60% of Americans lived in counties that were decided by 20 points or more. And I think it was similar in this election. And we have sorted out, up and down the ballot. I mean, one of the reasons why these 2 Senate races today are so consequential is because Democrats, despite raising ungodly sums of money, failed to win a single Senate seat in any state that Trump carried, right? I mean, that was what happened. Iowa looked like it was possible. North Carolina, South Carolina, maybe, Kentucky, maybe. They all failed. They all fell short. And in fact, in the last two elections, 2016 was the first time in American history that every Senate race went the same way as the presidential race in that state. 2020, the same thing happened again, with the only exception being Susan Collins in Maine. So basically, Republicans now dominate all the Senate seats in the states that voted for Trump. Democrats have, dominate the Senate seats in the states that voted for Clinton and Biden. In the House, there are roughly only 10 members on each side who won states that voted the other way for president. So we are partitioning up and down the ballot. And that, I think, is the most, and I think the bifurcated media fits into that and reinforces it. But I think the fundamental force is the geographic realignment of the parties to the point where essentially every large metro in the country, no matter what the state, is getting more Democratic.
So I was going to say,
and outside the metros, it's getting more Republican.
Is it the urban-rural divide that you're talking about?
Pretty much. I think it is. And everything that goes with that, right? I mean, the urban-rural divide also overlaps with the diversity divide. It overlaps with the religious diversity divide. We're down to roughly, for most of American history, white people who were Christians were a majority of the country for like almost all of American history. And sometime around 2010 or 2011, they fell below a majority. They're now like 42 or 43% of the country are white Christians, as a growing share of Americans are either non-white or not affiliated with any religion.
Right.
But that is a big urban-rural divide too, right? I mean, you go to small town America, it's pretty white Christian. Except for the places that have large black populations. And if you're in urban America, there are a lot more seculars. If you look at the college, non-college divide, you look at the diversity divide. So yeah, all of these things, all of these demographic factors play into the geographic sorting. And you are going to see that on steroids tonight in Georgia. I mean, what's the story in Georgia today? There's only one way for Republicans to win, right? Which is a very large turnout of the rural white voters who voted Democratic for 100 years or more, 125 years, from like the 1870s to like the 1990s. But they are now the foundation of the Republican Party. And if the Republicans are going to hold the Senate, it's going to be because, as in Texas and North Carolina and Iowa and South Carolina, their dominance of small town, rural, exurban America, preponderantly white communities, is so great that it overcomes the growing Democratic strength in the metros, basically in every state. Yeah, every state now has the same politics.
I did a documentary series, and one of them was on white anxiety. And even small rural, they're growing, they're becoming increasingly diverse. And as older white Americans honestly die off, and more young people gravitate to cities. Now the pandemic that equation somewhat. But, I went to Storm Lake, Iowa, which...
Oh, yeah. Pat Buchanan had that famous rally in 1996 against immigrants.
And I went there, and it's one of the diverse cities, and places in the country, because it had a Vietnamese population, Somalian population. It is really like a Benetton ad. Yes. And it's a majority minority already, which the whole country will be by 2040. So you see these shifts, and I think it's not just going to be metro areas, but eventually, don't you think that many rural towns will start looking like many cities do? And that's one of the reasons that a lot of white voters are kind of, hanging on to some of these values.
Right. Well, I think that's entirely possible. I mean, the demographic change has unfolded unevenly across the country, but it is reaching more. And a majority of the under 18 population as of this year are kids of color, and I believe the number is in over something like 47 states. From 2000 to 2020, the number of white kids, not the share, the number of white kids was lower in the late 20 teens than it was in the year 2000. So like it's in Iowa, in Des Moines, a majority of the kids in the public school system are non-white, right? So it's kind of happening everywhere, but it's not happening evenly. And one of the things that does seem to be occurring is kind of this action-reaction cycle. And if you titled your documentary White Anxiety, you certainly saw this, which is that I believe that as the non-college white share of the population shrinks, as the Christian white share of the population shrinks, more of that reduced core is open to a Trump-like message of we have to stick together.
Right.
We have to stick, it's racial identity against the change. And he's got an audience for that. And it was bigger than we thought. Again, 74 million people amid a pandemic that was the worst in a century voted for Trump. And it even appealed to, a growing number of Hispanic and African-American men in particular. Now, I don't know if Republicans can sustain that. I mean, Bush and Reagan also saw an increase in their reelection races. But I believe the fundamental fault line in our politics, and we'll see it again in Georgia today, is between those voters and places that are comfortable with the way America is changing on every front, demographically, culturally, and economically, and those that aren't. And that is the divide.
That's such a good point. I think that sort of undercurrent of anxiety has been exacerbated or actually kind of unleashed, if you will, by some of the rhetoric that, the anti-immigration rhetorics, some of the, racist rhetoric.
Yeah. Well, the core of the Trump message is that
we have a frozen. Hold on. Stand by, everybody.
Am I frozen?
Yeah, but now
I'm back.
Yeah.
The core of the Trump message echoes Pat Buchanan from Storm Lake, echoes George Wallace from the 60s. And it is basically, you are the real America. You in my audience, you are the real America. And you are under siege from above, from elites who are disdainful of you and your values, and from below, from minorities who are dangerous. MS-13, he literally said last night, MS-13 gangs are going to be in your kids' schools if Biden wins. So it's basically, it has always been this two-pronged argument that you, the virtuous real America, i.e. white, Christian, working class America, you are under threat from elites who disdain you and minorities who threaten you. And that is the two-pronged message that Trump offers. I don't think it goes away when he does. There's a big audience for it. It's not a majority of the country. Democrats have won the popular vote in 7 out of 8 elections, which no party has ever done in American history since the formation of the modern party system, which was 1828 for those of you taking notes at home. But given the geographic distribution of these different coalitions, it's hard for this this coalition to govern. They've won the White House, as I said, they won the popular vote 7 out of 8, but twice in there they lost the Electoral College. Very hard to win the Senate because, remember, Democrats at one point had all 4 Senate seats from North Dakota and South Dakota.
Yeah.
In those Frank from Idaho in the 70s, Tom Daschle from South Dakota, they were able to compete in those white states when this culture, the cleavage in American politics was not so clearly oriented around change, transformation versus restoration, as I call it. But now that it's essentially a census on whether you support, whether you are comfortable with or are aggrieved by the way America is changing, you can't win any of those states. And so it leaves them with a very narrow margin to a Senate majority. They win both seats in Senate in Georgia today. They haven't elected a single senator in Georgia since 2000, and they've got to win both today to get to 50.
What are the tea leaves telling you, Ron? Obviously, the polls don't close till 7. We're not going to know for a number of days because of mail-in votes. But what do you think is going to happen in Georgia? Oops.
Well, first of all, I was on the air on CNN when Biden went ahead in Georgia, and from my can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Up.
I can hear you.
So I was on TV. I was on CNN when Biden went ahead in Georgia, and I think that was Friday night, November 6th at like 2 a.m. So
right.
Idea. I actually think Georgia is pretty simple. But both parties seem to agree that Democrats are further ahead going into Election Day than they were in November, but not so far ahead that Republicans can't overcome it if they get a very big turnout today. They probably need the math was in November, 4 million people voted before Election Day and 1 million people voted on Election Day. Republicans probably need more than 1 million people to vote today, which
Yeah.
is asking a lot. A special election where more than 1 million people will vote than more people will vote than in the general, but it's not inconceivable. I mean,
Yeah.
I think both sides agree Democrats are ahead. They're probably ahead by more than they were last time. But if Trump, his superpower as a politician is turnout. And if he can generate this huge rural white turnout, because it does not look like there are a lot of day of voters left for Democrats. Turnout is not that high in the Atlanta metro. So really, the only critical issue that's left. What's that?
How effective was that rally last night in terms of getting people to turn out? Can you hear me? I guess we're having some Wi-Fi issues. Can you hear me, Ron?
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
If you look at it, in the normal way we look at things, yeah, I can hear you. Yeah, you kind of went in and out, but I heard you. If you look at it in the way that, yes, I can. Katie, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. I think we're having some Wi-Fi issues. So I was just saying, how effective was that rally?
Yeah. If you look at it, normally you'd say not that active because he spent too much time attacking other Republicans and not enough, going after the Democrats. But Trump has shown, if nothing else, he can turn out his voters. So I don't think any Democrat's going to sleep easy till they see the polls close and they know what the turnout looks in those rural counties. They probably have a pretty substantial lead going into election day. They did everything they could have beforehand, right. But this is the basic trade Trump has imposed on the Republican Party. I mean, he is basically. I was thinking, just think about Kelly Loeffler and David Perdue, like the two most buttoned down country club business Republican types that you could imagine, on the golf links, are dependent on rural Georgia turning out in astronomical numbers. And that is just a microcosm of what Trump has done to the party. They're like all addicted to the same drug that he is now. Like the drug of finding a way to maximize turnout among non-college and non-urban and evangelical. They all have to do that now.
Hey, Ron, it was interesting. Let's pick what's going to happen tomorrow on the Hill. Tammy Loeffler, you were watching that rally last night, stood up and said, I'm going to object to the results of the election. Big cheer for that. She's among people that Margaret Sullivan says journalists should start calling the radical right, not just conservatives, but radicals in their own party, which I thought.
Well, yeah.
What do you think? Give us a preview of what you're expecting will happen tomorrow and how Mike Pence, could potentially wreak some havoc.
Yeah, I lost a little of the question, but I got the gist. Look, I think tomorrow is another milestone in a process that has been going on for a while. And the process that's been going on for a while is that fear of demographic eclipse, I believe, is eroding the commitment to democracy among a big chunk of the Republican voter base and their elected officials. I mean, you can go back to what happened after 2010. After the big Republican win in 2010, they started passing all of these laws in red states, making it harder to vote. 2013, the Supreme Court, the Republican appointees in the Supreme Court eviscerated the Voting Rights Act in the Shelby County decision. 2016, Mitch McConnell refused to allow a Supreme Court nominee to be voted on. In the Trump presidency, we have seen Republicans either look the other way or openly support him as he has tried to weaponize the Postal Service, as he's tried to tilt the Census Bureau, as first time ever to tilt the census to the advantage of one party, as he openly extorted the government of Ukraine to try to manufacture dirt on his opponent. And then everything that's happened since the election. 2/3 of House Republicans and 2/3 of Republican state attorneys general joining this lawsuit to invalidate 20 million voters. In all of these ways, I think you can see a pretty consistent movement where the Republican Party, not all of it, but a piece of it, is morphing out of the Western, small d, democratic political tradition, beginning to look more like one of these parties you see in Hungary or Turkey, where you win an election and then you use the instruments of the state to try to prevent the other side from ever winning again. And That is what's happening. We don't have I've said this many times on TV. We don't really have a language to describe what's happening. I don't know if you saw today in the Pennsylvania state legislature, the Republican majority refused to seat a Democrat who pretty clearly won his seat. The state Supreme Court has said he won his seat because the Republican is claiming, quote, fraud or irregularity. And the direction we're heading is toward an absolute crisis, because I think that there is enough of the Republican Party that at this point feels that if Democrats win, they will fundamentally change what America is in an irrevocable way, and therefore any means necessary to prevent that is justified. Kind of the Flight 93 election idea forever. And democracy just cannot survive if only one party is committed to it.
If you guys like what you see, subscribe right here.